in words by somebody who's supposed to have divine authority, you have hard facts that can't be denied. And the question is then, do you really think it makes a difference whether somebody actually speaks a prophecy or not? That is, could it be that in exactly the same circumstances, Peter would have been able not to deny Christ, but he became unable simply because Christ predicted it? I don't think so. So, as usual with arguments about divine foreknowledge, and people present ways out for the person who wants to say you have both foreknowledge and freedom that are fairly easily got around. Even if they're right as far as it goes, you can find other arguments that do an end run around those arguments. I don't know. Does that help?
Yeah, for sure. And he was also wondering, as you've written, I think, a paper or two on Molinism, including one called Against Middle Knowledge, quite a while ago now. But I think he was wondering what your thoughts on sort of Molinist views are now, if you have any.
Well, I take it by Molinism in the present context, we can understand the view that there are true counterfactuals of freedom.
Right.
So nobody, let's say, offered me a bribe to pass a certain student who wasn't doing very well. Let's say maybe the student's father even considered it, but then decided it would be counterproductive or something. But what would I freely have done if the bribe had been offered to me? There doesn't have to be an answer to that, as far as I can see. Not if you believe that free will, that is being able to do otherwise, because I don't have any of these fancy bells and whistles views of free will. If let me see exactly how I want to put this. If free will, in that sense, implies indeterminism, it seems to me there are equally close worlds in which I do one thing and the other. In which, if I had been offered the bribe, there's a world in which I take the bribe, and there's an equally close world in which I don't. And there's just no basis in reality for saying that one of those worlds is the one that's going to become actual, or would have become actual. And in a way, this doesn't have anything to. The only thing this has to do with free will comes from the premise that free will implies indeterminism. I mean, suppose we have a little indeterministic box, and there's a button on the box, and there's two lights, and if you press the button, either the red light will flash or the green light will flash, but it's indeterminate which. So if you had pressed the button 1 minute ago, would the light have flashed red or would it have flashed green? I don't see that there has to be an answer to that question. In fact, I don't see how there could be an answer to that question. Reality just consists in, if you had pressed that button, it might have flashed red, and if you had pressed that button, it might have flashed green. And if I had been offered the bribe, I might have taken it, and I might not have taken it. If it's true that I might that I would not have taken it, that could only be true because I could not have taken it. That is, that I was not able to take it. That is, that it was contrary to my character or some other feature of the situation.
So the idea is that the counterfactuals of freedom they're not really true, and so it's basically the grounding
That's right.
objection.
All the counterfactuals of freedom are false.
Right. You mentioned a lot of most notions of modality in that reply, and I was wondering if you had a particular view on what modality is, or how do we explain it, especially given some accounts that are more like conventionalist in nature. If you wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, it can't be conventionalist unless it thinks that you give an account of modality by talking about modal sentences, right? I don't think that modality is in any way language dependent. I don't. I think modality is one of those that is possibility and necessity. These are things that are so basic to our ways of talking and thinking that there are no simpler terms that we can use to give an account of them. You know, in moral philosophy, people talk about the moral circle. You know, you've got forbidden, permissible, and obligatory. And well, you could, if you have permissible, you can define obligatory as not permissible, not, or you could define them in terms of the others. Well, I think you've got, but you can't break into the moral circle. I'd say there's a modal circle. You've got possible and necessary. Well, possible is not necessary, not, or necessary is not possible, not. But there's no way to break into the circle. Probably there's also a generality circle. You know, all is not, some not, some is not, all not. Well, yeah, fine, but you can't. There's no way to enter by definition. The only person who's tried to break into the modal circle from outside is David Lewis. You know, his definitions of modality involve only spatiotemporal concepts and set theoretical and logical concepts. I just don't think that is, according to David, for example, to say there could have been a million carat. There isn't any million carat diamond, but there could have been one. What when you're saying that is there's no million carat diamond that's spatiotemporally related to us, but there is a million carat diamond that's not spatiotemporally related to us. I don't think that that's what it just strikes me that that's not what there could have been a million carat diamond means.
All right, we had a couple more philosophy of religion related questions. This one from Key. He was wondering, you have a paper where you defend the compatibility of Platonism and theism. Yes, what are your thoughts on the nature of such abstracta? Are they grounded in the spatio-temporal realm, a la Zalta, or are they grounded in any way in God's nature, a la the scholastics, or something else?
We would have to ask what you mean by grounded.
Right.
I would say, first of all, that abstracta are not causal. They can be neither agents nor patients. They can't enter into causal relations at all. Now, if you're thinking of grounding as something like a causal relation, they're not grounded in anything. Also, because they're not grounded, they're not created, because creation is a causal relation, and that coheres nicely with another view that I think all abstracta are necessarily existent. So there necessarily existed uncreated things. And I didn't hear in the question quite whether the person who asked the question said, you have written a paper on this, or have you written a paper on this? Which one?
You have written a paper on the
Yes.
compatibility of Platonism and theism. Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, I'm working on a debate book with William Lane Craig right now on that topic.
Oh, awesome. He had a couple more of religion-related
Sure.
questions. One a little bit more personal, where he had read your autobiography and was wondering about your general conversion, where he notes that it seems like it was more of a stance, a gaining of certain intuitions that led you to some of your religious beliefs. And he's wondering, is this correct, first of all? And he's wondering if you were to preach the gospel to yourself prior to that conversion, how would you go about it?
First of all, if he doesn't understand, I don't understand it either, so I can't talk about it. I simply found myself, well, I've described it as being like a rusty nut that's frozen to a bolt being turned by main force. There was really very little that I had to do with it, and I can't really describe I don't think I did anything. So it's something that happened to me. Now, I can say the only role that philosophy played in this was maybe undermining some bad arguments against the position I was being converted to. It certainly didn't do anything positive um, there, but I really don't know how to answer uh, questions like that. I have a feeling now that part of that question, though, escaped my memory while I was talking. Did I miss some part of that question? Something about something. Oh,
Yeah,
preaching the gospel to.
to yourself, like as if you had an opportunity to talk to yourself prior to your gaining of those beliefs.
I don't know. I mean, I certainly got the gospel preached to me. I don't know that I preached it to myself. I mean, how
No,
would
the
I?
question is how if contra, possibly had you had the opportunity to preach it to yourself, how might you have gone about that? I guess.
Well, I don't know what I could do except uh, quote the Gospels and Paul's letters where the gospel is preached. That's sort of the definitive statement. I mean, words are very hard. The right words are very hard. I remember that's my dear friend, the late Lynn Runner Baker, said to me, describing her view of the world. She said, "I believe that love and forgiveness underlie everything." And that statement really impressed me. When a couple of years later I told her that statement had impressed me, she said, "Oh, I'm so embarrassed that I said that. It's such a stupid thing to say. I really should have said I accept the Nicene Creed." But and I told her I don't really see any inconsistency there. I think both that you probably are doing more good and effective preaching of the gospel by saying, "I believe that love and forgiveness uh, underlie everything," than by reciting the Nicene Creed. But um, I have to say, in the end, I'm really not sure I understand what the questioner is looking for with those words about preaching, how I would have preached the gospel to myself.
Well,
Was it,
I guess
how did I understand the gospel?
I guess a better way to ask the question is, were you to preach it to someone else today, maybe someone else that was in a similar place that you were before you had been converted? What are some approaches you would take?
Usually it takes that rarely I do that. So once I had a graduate student, this is many years ago, and the person in question has been a Christian for many years. But when she was a graduate student, she came into my office and said to me angrily, "Tell me why you believe in God." Confrontational, I dealt with the question. I didn't talk about the gospel yet. Usually I respond, I guess, by trying to, if people can't be preached to unless they want to listen. And usually the people that want to listen and to me talk about it come with some hostile or confrontational question. I try to deconstruct the question, take it apart, see where it's coming from. Pretty much the way I would if it was a hostile question about my philosophy, like Mysterianism and free will, or something like that. This is not the way I recommend to anybody who wants to preach the gospel to do it, because it wouldn't work for everybody. It's just what seems to me the way that's been given to me to do it.
All right. Key had a few more questions, but I'll move on to someone else, some others before. So Timber had a question. He says, "Hi, Professor. I've read a few of your papers criticizing ontological arguments for God. Do you have any arguments for God which you like?"
Well, so what philosophical arguments do I like? Let's say I like the consequence argument, for example, we talked about that. But
Right.
I don't think that there are any knockdown arguments in philosophy. I don't think there are any arguments where, well, Robert Nozick once said that when he was a young man, he thought the ideal philosophical argument would be one where if you understood the premises and you didn't accept the conclusion, you would die. Well, there aren't any arguments like that, and there aren't even, I think, any philosophical arguments that are for, let's say, substantive positive conclusions, where if you understand the premises and you don't accept the conclusion, you're irrational. Maybe there's arguments for, very limited negative conclusions, like knowledge is not simply justified true belief. Or formalism is not the right philosophy of mathematics. Yeah, maybe there are, but those are negative conclusions. One would want to, notice that knowledge is not simply justified true belief, is not an analysis of knowledge. Formalism is not the right philosophy of mathematics, is not a philosophy of mathematics. I don't think there are any knockdown arguments in this area. So I don't think there are any knockdown arguments for the existence of God. I'm not even sure there are any arguments for the existence of God, as opposed to arguments for the existence of a being who, that is, for the existence of a being that fills some role, or it's a role that God could fill, but other lesser beings could fill it as well. Now, for example, you have Hume points out, in his dialogues concerning natural religion, that the conclusion, even if you accept the conclusion of Cleanthes's design argument, there could be lots of gods who are the designer of the world, and they could all be dead now, and they could have been people who are learning slowly to build universes by experience and are not very good at it yet, which is the reason for all the stuff that's wrong in ours. All that is not only consistent with the conclusion of the design argument, it might even be a stronger position to argue for from design, since it makes the gods that designed this world more closely analogous with the designers of human artifacts. I would say that that point of Hume's generalizes to all the arguments for the existence of God, with the possible exception of the ontological argument. I used to think that the ontological argument was the only argument that really was an argument for the existence of God. But then my friend Chris Hughes told me that he thought that Plotinus won was if both Plotinus won and Anselm's God existed, Plotinus one would be a greater being than Anselm's God. Why? Because Anselm's God has to be a person, and that's a limitation. The one is beyond personality. Well, gosh, then maybe what if the ontological argument did prove something? It would prove the existence of Plotinus one and not the existence of God. If that's true, then even the ontological argument isn't even really an argument for the existence of God. Any of the other, as to the other arguments, like the cosmological argument, there's no reason why why the being that fills the role that the cosmological argument tries to say is filled, why it shouldn't be a finite being. A big enough finite being is capable of creating this world, after all. No, if God is really infinite and any creature has to be finite, then, well, for any finite creature, there's a greater one, even a much greater one. So I don't think that there could be an argument for the existence of God, not just because the argument would have difficulty being valid or sound, but it would even have difficulty having a conclusion that really could be read as God exists.
Interesting. So, and he also follows up on a related note. Graham Oppy has a slogan that theory comes before arguments. So rather than examining specific arguments for and against God, according to him, we should be comparing the theists and atheist worldviews for how they best explain all the data and their relative explanatory virtues. What do you think of this general project or approach to philosophy of religion and to disagreements in philosophy more generally?
Well, I both agree and disagree. I agree we should be comparing, not what we should be comparing is general worldviews. I don't think we should compare them as to how they explain, because I don't think they explain. I've always been an enemy of the view that it's the business of philosophy to explain things. Rather, it's the business of philosophy to try to establish things. So I give arguments, right, for things that is, I try to give an ordered presentation of the reasons for thinking that certain things are true. I've never seen anybody give a successful example of a philosopher explaining something. But I've seen lots of cases where philosophers think they explain things, and in my view, the thing to be explained isn't there to be explained. My paradigm case is always Armstrong's work on universals, where it seems to me all the things that the universals are supposed to explain aren't there to explain. I don't know what God explains. People, is he supposed to explain the existence of the world? To me, believing in God because you postulated him to explain the existence of the world would be like, I don't know, believing that my wife has mental states in order to account for the movements of her body. really, this is just not the way I look at things. So, bottom line, yeah, I think we should be comparing theism and atheism as a whole, as wholes, but not in respect of how well they explain things.
Wait, if I may. Oh, sorry. I wasn't able to hear some of that question, some of your answers. So could you repeat, like, on how would we compare them? I apologize if you have to.
Compare them not in how well they explain things, because I don't think either of them is designed to explain anything.
But on how well they establish.
Well, each faces difficulties, counterexamples, problems. There's considerations that are put forward. There are ways that they fit into one's life. For example, I mean, there's all kinds of things that you could say. I mean, some of them have not too much to do with philosophy. Like each side accuses the other, for example, of being the source of a lot of war and conflict and violence in the world. That's an accusation, but it isn't that doesn't have to do with explaining things, I think.
But does that, like, get you closer to the truth of which one is right? Those kind of considerations.
Don't you think if somebody says your views are socially harmful, that's something you should answer?
I think it's something you should answer, but does it really affect whether it's right or wrong? Not morally, but
Why do you go on to ask that? It's something that should be answered. If you can't answer it, it's a difficulty for your view. If you want to hang tough and say, yeah, I know that my views are socially and morally harmful, that people die because people believe these things, nevertheless, they're true.
so these are the kind of
That
additional
strikes me as a downside to your view. It doesn't refute it. By definition, it doesn't show that it's false. But it's something that needs to be brought out.
because at least with explanatory virtues, the idea is that the theory that sort of has the most virtues is more probable.
Well, yeah, sure, if there were such virtues, but I don't think either atheism or theism has any such virtues.
Sure,
I
sure.
don't think either explains anything.
All right, I think we'll move on to a few VC questions we have lined up. So, Scrungy, if you want to unmute and ask your questions, you can do that. Scrungy, you there?
Sorry, I had audio issues. Hello, Dr. Peter Van Inwagen. I have a follow-up question to your saying about free will. So I think it seems like you're operating in kind of an medias res. You're taking that kind of approach in the sense that we're not giving up on blame and praise. We're sort of starting from that, and that just means something like we're not giving up that which explains blame and praise and responsibility. Now, I guess the question for me is that why is it? It must be your arguments, but to me, a lot of people are that way. They're not going to give up whatever explains blame and praise, but they're willing to look at something like libertarian free will as not being that, right? Not and maybe analytically or whatever. So I guess I'm asking, my question is, why not just give up something like libertarian free will and then just accept whatever is in the world that explains blame and praise?
Well, so you use all these words that I would never use. Praise, responsibility, libertarian free will. I do think I talk about blame and fault, being able to do various things. If you want to I think if I think people are to blame for something, I don't think that anything explains that, but I do think certain things follow from it. I've never talked, as I say, I don't talk about explanation at all, but I do think
I don't mean
I do
a
think it
causal explanation.
follows from blame that from being able to blame people that they were able to do something other than what you're blaming them for. If I say to somebody, "It's your fault. You were supposed to feed my cat and you didn't while I was away. The cat's dead. That's your fault." I think that presupposes, or what I say entails, the person was able to feed the cat. Don't you? Don't you think that if I say you should have fed the cat, yeah, I'm saying that implies that you were able to feed the cat?
Yeah, I think I accept the notion of ought implies can.
And if so, then the question is then, does able to do so imply that the action was not determined not to happen causally? Well, there's an argument there. I mean, I just go by the arguments.
Yeah, I didn't mean like I guess I meant it that which makes it possible, right? That what there's something in the world, some inquiry that about what makes it possible that we can say that something is your fault or
Well, all right, but I would be, instead of what makes it possible, I would prefer to say, if we have the blame, what follows from it? And
like what does blame mean?
what can we deduce from if if something is somebody's fault, what follows from that?
That they should correct themselves?
No, I mean that it doesn't follow from that the person was able to do otherwise. Now, in one sense, you can reduce that to possibility because obviously an argument is valid only if it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. But I'm really thinking more of logical deducibility. What's logic? Is the ability to do otherwise logically deducible from blameworthiness? I think so. And other things are then deducible from the ability to do otherwise, that is indeterminism. And if libertarian free will is libertarian free will just the ability to do otherwise plus incompatibilism?
Are you asking me?
Yeah. Well, you use the phrase libertarian free will. Is that how you use it? Just the conjunction of those two theses?
I suppose so. That I guess there's the notion of indeterminacy there too. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but incompatibilism means so if free will is incompatible with determinism, that I suppose includes the notion of indeterminacy.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to know how you would respond to that question, but I guess my main question, I that was from what you said to someone else, but my main question, it doesn't have to do with free will. I was wondering if the idea, the incoherence of monocategorical ontologies poses a threat to naturalism and certain strains of idealism. The idea that if everything is natural or if everything is mental, it seems to there seems to be a problem of vacuity there with respect to the terms natural or mental or whatever.
Well, of course, there's all kinds of monocategorical ontologies. And Laurie Paul says that everything is a property, for example. You're a property, I'm a property, redness is a property, just very different kinds of properties. Or you have the new bundle theory of Jim Van Cleve, although he doesn't accept it. He's just his example where there's there just aren't any things besides what later came to be called tropes. Yeah, I can't make much sense of those. I think by monocategorical, though, you were talking about things like idealism and materialism, right?
Yeah, something like that. That if everything is natural, then to predicate natural of an object just seems to be sort of vacuous.
Well, let's see. So it's, the question is, would there be some important meaning that we could attach, say, to immaterial if we thought everything was material? I mean, I think just taking a universally applicable notion and putting "not" before it doesn't mean that you're saying much. I mean,
So it seems like you're in partial agreement at the least.
yeah, well, I mean, since I'm not an adherent either of idealism or materialism, um, it's hard for me to speak on behalf of that person because I'm not sure about the intuitions that guide.
I try to think of it in terms of like the sort of responses that we might have to like psychological egoism or egoism, that if you define every action as just selfish, it just, then the notion of an altruistic action is just incoherent, and then the notion of a selfish action is just redundant. And so, in the same way that if we predicate all things that exist in terms of X, then to predicate X of one individual thing is not, it's just saying that it's part of everything or something.
Well, that's not implausible. There are certain considerations that make me wonder about it. For example, in Aubrey's Brief Lives, there's a little capsule biography of Hobbes, and there's this anecdote told. Hobbes and a friend are on a walk, and they pass a beggar, and Hobbes gives him a handsome amount of money, and the friend says, "There, you see, you can't live up to your own principles. You say everybody's selfish, but you're generous." And Hobbes says, "No, on the contrary. When I see a man destitute like that, I experience some unpleasant sensations in myself. I find that I can make them go away by giving the person money, or some kind of benefit." Now, it seems to me that if you were right, then Hobbes would be ascribing altruism to himself, just not under that name. That would, unbeknown to Hobbes, that would really be a description of an altruistic action, even though Hobbes thinks it isn't. I don't know. I think Butler is onto something when he says, no, we just do have desires that aren't desires to help ourselves. There's no reason that you can't have a desire to help someone else, because everything is what it is and not another thing. A desire to help someone else is not a desire to make some nasty sensation inside yourself go away by helping someone else. That is, it's not, the desire to help someone else does not have to be a desire based on the intrinsic, on the extrinsic goodness of helping someone else. It can be based on the perceived intrinsic goodness of helping someone else. I mean, why not? That is, if you wanted to make altruistic robots, would you make them examine their own inner sensations, and find some of them unpleasant and then try to remove those? Or if you wanted to make them efficiently altruistic, why not just make it part of their design that sometimes they desire to help other people? I'm pretty sure that's certainly part of the design of maternal animals in nature. I expect it's part of the design of all of us. So I'm inclined to think that plausible is what you say sounds. We can actually find a wedge to drive between psychological egoism and theories that allow for altruism in a more straightforward and literal sense than the sense in which Hobbes in the story was willing to allow for it. I kind of rambled there. I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate your answer. Thank you so much.
Text question from Bryn, who asked, do you have any thoughts about the degree to which downward causation as action, as presented by Helen Stewart, for example, is successful in defending agent causal libertarian free will?
Well, as I said, I don't know what libertarian free will is, and I don't think agent causation, even if it were real, helps. And the reason is, if you consider the replay argument, you have this woman saying who's deciding between lying and telling the truth, and she makes an causally indeterminate decision, and she tells the truth. Well, the next time, then suppose God returns the world to exactly its state the moment before she made the decision. If it really was indeterminate, she might make the different decision the second time. So you would get, I think, on a large number of replays, the action going one way and the action going the other way. Lying, truth, 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 lie, lie, truth, lie, lie, truth. It all looks very random. So in the first case, it's plausible to say there wasn't any reason for her acting that way. This is what I consider the most powerful argument for the incompatibility of indetermination and free will. Now, does agent causation help with that argument? No, because what you're going to see then is assume agent causation. Each time agent causes lying or telling the truth, you're going to see agent causing telling the truth, agent causing telling the truth, agent causing lying, agent causing lying, agent causing telling the truth, agent causing telling the truth, agent causing lying, agent causing telling the truth. This random series of agent causings. Well, I mean, why? It still seems that it's random what you agent caused the first time. Now, some people say, well, you would get the same thing each time. I don't see how you would get the same thing each time if it was really indeterminate. If somebody says that it was indeterminate whether A would be followed by B, and yet in 1,000 perfect duplicates of this situation, we can be confident that A will be followed by B. I think I've lost track of why it is that this is supposed to be indeterminate. So I don't think that any account of agent causation helps with anything having to do with free will at all.
All right. We had another VC question from David Lee Roth. If you want to unmute, you can ask.
Hello, Dr. Van Inwagen. I hope my microphone is working well, and I'm coming in. So yeah, I had several questions, but I'm going to start with one for the sake of time, and if we can get to others, then that will be fine. So my first question is, you provide a very strong argument for incompatibilism, but recent polls show that as many as close to 60% of philosophers still accept compatibilism. What is your best explanation for why this is, and why has how should I put this? Why have more philosophers not been swayed to accept some form of incompatibilism or reject compatibilism? Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, I think the data are corrupt because philosophers working on the free will problem in the past 20 years have ruined the term incompatibilism, because half the time they mean incompatibility of free will and moral responsibility, and not free will and the ability to do otherwise. You don't know these days, and the Chalmers the Chalmers questionnaire didn't make it clear in what sense they were using incompatibilism. Secondly, I think that it is I would say that we need to examine the following thesis if you want to have. First of all, differentiate between philosophers who actually work on free will and philosophers who don't. I would say if you ask the question, is the ability to do otherwise than one does compatible with strict causal determinism, you would get a much higher response among the philosophers who actually have worked on the free will problem than the Chalmers data suggest. That, at any rate, is my opinion.
All right, thanks for that. We had a question from Verbal Siege Engine, where he asked, you have argued that exist is quantification and that exist is univocal. One argument you make in favor of this is that there exists claims can be thought of as an inclusive disjunction with respect to a universal domain. Because inclusive disjunction is univocal, then it follows that we should understand existence claim as univocal. However, there are different logics. If we use multi-valued logics, for example, cleans, then the truth table will look different, and it's not clear that a univocal understanding of exists follows. What do you think of this sort of response?
So, actually, I mean, I mentioned that Carnap had used that argument. I don't really think I ever endorsed it myself because I pointed out that. So Carnap's example was, well, to say that there exists a prime number between 15 and 20 is just to say that either 15 is a prime number, or 16 is a prime number, or 17 is a prime number, or 18 is a prime number, or 19 is a prime number, or 20 is a prime number. And I said, not so fast, Carnap. You also need to say that that's all, that 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20 are all the numbers between 15 and 20. And once you got all there, all you need is all and not to define some. So why not define existence this way? Forget about quantifiers or any symbol from formal logic. I would say that X exists just means this: not everything is not X. So to say God exists is to say not everything is not God. To say that Berkeley's lost manuscript on ethics exists is to say not everything is not Berkeley's lost manuscript on ethics. And the unqualified all and not, it's not the case that those both seem to me to be univocal. So that's how I would defend the univocality of existence.
All right. We had another VC question from Shinichi. If you want to unmute, you can ask your question.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thanks for doing the AMA. I had a couple of questions, but I wanted to ask first about something about mereology. You famously defend a view, among other places, of material beings, where you say that the only kinds of composite objects are things that are living, or I should say that make up organisms. And I wanted to ask, when you're giving some sort of answer to the special composition question, firstly, do you think that there's certain kinds of universalists and nihilists have said that there's a kind of extra vagueness that comes in no matter how you answer that question? And I want to get your thoughts on that. But also, I wanted to know, when you're giving your criteria for an organism, I've always been curious. If I had, for instance, say at some time t, I have me, and then say in a swamp somewhere else, a thunderbolt comes down and rearranges molecules such that it's an identical copy of me at T, but only for a split nanosecond. So none of the typical processes we want to associate with organisms takes place. And then afterward it disintegrates. Would that, at that time T, count as a composite object on your view?
Why does it disintegrate?
It just because I'm just giving like a swamp man kind of example. So it just so happens that it suddenly is created and then for whatever reason just immediately like disappears.
Well, if it's a perfect duplicate of you, why don't you just suddenly disintegrate?
Well, let's just say there's something, since it's in a swamp somewhere else, there's a something that causes it to. Say a thunderbolt comes down and hits it and destroys it.
Okay, that is, something produces an organism. It lasts just for a fraction of a second, and a thunderbolt destroys it. Is that the situation?
Yes. But just to be clear, the reason I was asking was if you thought that, given that it was such a split like nanosecond, there was not enough time for the kinds of typical, like generally, I think you mentioned in the book that when we look at what biologists say about life, it has to do with certain kinds of metabolic processes, things that allow the organism to, have homeostasis and so on, and that kind of thing doesn't happen, at least on the time scale here. So that's why I was curious.
Yeah, well, I mean, if it really is a perfect causal duplicate of you, so you got all these electrons, up quarks, down quarks, distributed in the same way. They're exchanging photons and gluons in the same way, and they can do a lot of photon and gluon exchanging in that nanosecond. Yeah, I'd be willing to say that look, the process going on, it wasn't able to go on very long. I mean, but if you make say, suppose you've got a nice ball bearing on a slope rolling down the slope, does it and it just comes into existence for some strange reason and then is destroyed. I guess it rolled down the slope a little bit, not much, but it didn't. I don't know. It's a question. I just don't see what the difficulty is there. I mean, it didn't not very much had time to happen, but everything that happens inside you in that nanosecond happened. Something happens inside you in that nanosecond. Same things happen in that thing.
Right. I was just merely asking because I wanted to see if there was some essential sort of, I guess, I don't want to say time scale, but certain processes that like would be essential for an organism that wouldn't be able to take place on that time scale, and therefore we wouldn't call it a composite object. But thank you for answering. It was very helpful. And just the minor thing, if you wanted to answer, was just what you thought about vagueness concerns when it comes to special composition. Any way you answer it.
Well, I mean, there's a whole last section of the book about that,
Right. So do you okay? So you don't think, presumably, your sort of answer is any worse than any other ones in terms of vagueness, that is?
Well, I think it exploits vagueness. For example, there's a profound problem raised by Peter Unger called the problem of the many. My answer exploits vagueness to solve that problem. And you want vagueness, right? If you think you are a biological organism, surely you don't think there's a first nanosecond during which you existed.
Right.
That would be like saying, asking for the first nanosecond during which you existed would be like asking for the first hour of the Wisconsin glaciation. There was a time when you definitely didn't exist yet. There was a time when you definitely did exist, but there wasn't a first mathematical instant during which that was either the first instant in which you existed or the last instant in which you didn't exist. The world isn't that sharp. So there has to be some vagueness in there somewhere.
Thank you.
All right, we had another. Go back to one of Key's questions. He asked, "You've written a paper along broadly Kripkensteinian lines, saying something like that there is no such thing as addition. What are your current thoughts on the nature of meaning? Currently, does it reduce purely to the mental or something else?"
I don't have any general thoughts on the nation of meaning. That paper was about a particular argument. I thought it could be put more convincingly than it had been put. So I tried to do that. But I have no theory about meaning. I mean, I accept a lot of things that people have said about meaning. Kripke, Putnam, Wittgenstein, lots of people have said things about meaning that have influenced me, but I don't think it adds up to my having any coherent, well, I don't mean my views are incoherent. I should say any general, well worked out view about meaning.
Fair enough, but you nevertheless you tend to accept a sort of skeptical Kripke skeptical solution on like rule following and stuff like that, or?
I think it's interesting. I'm not convinced. I don't. I'm not a philosopher of language. You know, I've taught a seminar on the book here at Duke. I don't think. What I am convinced of is that Kripke has presented a real problem. I'm very much inclined not to accept reference magnetism as a solution to the problem. Although I can't really say why. I think that's the only well worked out position that purports to be a solution to the problem that I have a definite opinion on.
All right, sounds good. Let's see. So Haiku was wondering what your thoughts are on William Lane Craig's defense of neutralism when he uses it to attack your usage of the criterion of ontological commitment.
So neutralism is the thesis that there's this use of the quantifier that's not ontologically committing. Is that
right? Yeah.
Well, it seems to me that if we have an absolutely, I think, univocal quantifier, there's no room for different interpretations of it, so there can't be a neutral interpretation of it. That is, I propose that there is an X such that Fx means absolutely everything. It's not the case that absolutely everything is such that it's not F. And I think absolutely everything and not are well defined. Now, I do, however, I mean, Craig has certain data. My own example here, I forget which examples he used, is Theodore the theologian has written this monumental book called Systematic Theology. And at one point in the book, she says, there is but one God, living and true, without body, parts, or passions. In another part of the book, she says, there is but one path to righteousness, and that is faith in Jesus Christ. that first one, it makes sense to say about this being. How can this being be living if he doesn't have any parts? I mean, isn't life a physical process? That's a legitimate question to somebody who says that. But if the person says, there is but one path to righteousness, and you start pressing her about the features of this path, I mean, where is it from to? Is this a path on the surface of the earth? No, that's a much less serious use of the existential quantifier. But it's not because, um, as Craig would think, that it has a different neutral meaning there. It's because the quantificational structure of the second sentence is sort of optional. You could say there is but one path to righteousness, and that is Jesus Christ. But you could also say we all need Christ to become righteous, or something like that. And there's no quantification over paths at all there. Whereas you're not going to you can't really get away from quantification in the first one. So we have, I'd say, a non-serious, there's only one meaning of quantification, but there are serious and non-serious uses of it. And the non-serious ones are where you use it as optional. That is, a non-serious use was, is there such a thing as free will? That's not serious because you could just ask, do people have free will? Or even, can people act otherwise? Whereas, do people have livers? That is not a question that where you can just dispense with the quantifier like that. Okay, does that help with neutralism?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to note at this point that we've been going for about an hour and a half, and I was just wondering if you're free to go a bit longer, or if you want to wrap up soon.
I think I could go till about 5 o'clock at the latest.
That sounds perfect. So, and also I'll just mention,
time.
right. I'll just mention to the people listening as well that if you want to ask a question in VC or text, you can post it in the discussion channel or AMA question channel. Let's see. We had a question from someone called Deleted User who was wondering about your thoughts on epistemic arguments against determinism. For example, he had in mind one posited by Robert Locke, not sure, who tries to show that the belief in determinism is self-defeating and that libertarian free will is necessary for a particular notion of epistemic justification to be possible. I guess, are you familiar with that?
I am not familiar with that, no.
Deleted User, if you want to get on VC and kind of elaborate on that, you can. But for now, I think we have one from David Lee Roth who wanted to ask in VC. You can unmute.
Yes, Professor Van Wagen, I have several questions, and I hope nobody minds if I list one or two, and if you have a problem, I'll be happy to remind you. So my first one right now will be, okay, so how do I pronounce it? Aside from the intuitive problem that arises from someone denying free will, something like, for example, the blame is not necessary, is there any philosophical problem, so to say, that you would have with negating free will? For example, someone who holds that free will doesn't exist, and they might acknowledge that, yes, this has some bad consequences, but, you know, this is what seems to accord with reality. So what would be your objection to that person who does agree that it has some very bad consequences, but wants to hold it because he believes this comports with reality?
Well, I mean, I think it's part of reality that there is such a thing as people being to blame for things. Remember, I said, I imagined before a reliable source, God say, informing me that there's no such thing as anything being anyone's fault, so the Holocaust and the Atlantic slave trade were not anyone's fault. Well, I said that my predominant reaction would be one of horror, but there would also be a more intellectual reaction, which is I don't understand the world at all. I don't see how I could be living in a world. And I'm not talking about the horror of the world. I'm saying this is like saying to, say, a paraconsistent logic person, I don't see how there can be such a thing as true contradictions. If God told me there were true contradictions, I would say, all right, you're God. I have to believe you, but I don't see how that could be. And if God says to me, there's no moral responsibility or nothing is anyone's fault, I say, well, I have to believe you, but I don't see how that could be. So to using this as using blame, the applicability of blame is a real feature of the world. That's as much a philosophical premise to me as any other premise in the argument. I hope that response was not based on a misunderstanding of what you were getting at.
No, I mean, I thought that was really good. Yes, I completely understand now. And if I may move quickly to my second question, the consequence argument, as it was formulated by you originally, I believe it was in 1983. My memory might have been betraying me now, but so a lot of compatibilists who I have talked to, and I have been persuaded by your argument. I just want to say it, so I am biased, but they say that while they acknowledge that the argument is probably the best one that incompatibilists have, say that it essentially begs the question against compatibilists, since no compatibilist would want to concede the minor premise of the argument, I believe. So what has your response been to such reactions, if you've gotten anything of the sorts? Thank you.
What's the minor premise?
Sorry, I believe the minor premise in this case would be that basically using the beta rule, that if we have no control over our actions and those actions entail our, well, what happens to us and the consequence of those actions is also beyond our control.
Yeah, well, I mean, they can hardly say it begs the question. They just want to say, right, I don't accept that premise. I mean, really, but I remember Rod Chisholm once saying in a similar circumstance when somebody accused him of begging the question because his premises entailed the conclusion. I seem to have been accused of the fallacy of affirming the antecedent. It's an argument. If the argument is valid, the premises entail the conclusion. So if you accept the denial of the conclusion, naturally you think at least one of the premises is false, and you may know which one. You may know which one there. And I think everybody agrees that if one of the premises of the argument is wrong, it's the beta rule. Or pretty much everybody. There's not, that's the one everybody attacks. And that's the one I said we should be talking about. So I don't, a lot of people find it very plausible. So it's a perfectly good argument just because if people who don't accept it, I've already said there are no knockdown arguments in philosophy. No argument is going to convince everybody. It does convince a lot of graduate students who come to it for the first time. No, and their teachers are unable to convince them not to be convinced by it. It's a very intuitive argument. That's all you can say for it because we don't have proofs in philosophy. This is not mathematics, after all.
I see. And if I may move to my third, and this will be final question, I promise. So basically, this question has to do with your criticism of agent causation and well, I think the way you formulated today was to say that you don't believe there is such a thing as libertarian free will. You just say free will. So, do you believe that all proposed solutions from those who call themselves libertarians and who would like to defend some form of, let's say, agent causation, maybe in theology, some sort of Molinism, do you think all of them are dead in the water? Do you think all of them run into the same problem, as you said, with the replay argument or do you think that there is a way to save what we call libertarian free will and perhaps some sort of agent causation also? Thanks.
Well, I do call myself a libertarian, but I insist that all I mean by that, libertarianism is just the conjunction of incompatibilism and the free will thesis. If you build more into it than that, some thesis about how free will works, yeah, then I don't accept it. I don't like the term libertarian free will because I think free will should mean the same thing for everybody. That's kind of an obsolete view now, though, because all these different meanings for free will have been proposed, all based on the illusion that there's some antecedent meaning that the term free will has, the way cause and knowledge do. It makes sense for philosophers to want to analyze cause and know and verbs like that because they really do play a role in everyday life. The term free will doesn't. I mean, we use it in everyday life, but only to mean lack of coercion, as when the judge in the courtroom asks you whether you did this of your own free will. So I just find these kinds of issues very hard to penetrate. I'm not sure what's going on here when people talk about libertarian free will. I mean, by free will, I mean that you're able to do things other than what you do. Well, I think libertarians, compatibilists, hard determinists, everybody means that and believes that. They have different analyses of it. The compatibilists mean, well, just because there's lots of stuff that you didn't choose to do, but if you had chosen to do it, you would do it. Something like that. But everybody believes that. So I guess I have to say, I don't really understand what people mean by libertarian free will, but I wish they would stop using the phrase. I wish they would stop holding the theories that they call libertarian free will theories. I just mean I wish they'd stop calling them that. And as to agent causation, well, I've already told you why I don't think that helps. It's not that I object to it because it's an agent cause. It's because it's a libertarian free will theory, whatever that means. I object to it because I don't see that it does any good. It doesn't do the good the person that wants it to do some good wants it to do.
All right. We had a couple more VC questions, and that might bring us near to the end. But first, we had one from Shinichi. If you want to unmute, you can ask yours.
Hi. I wanted to ask what you thought of gunk worlds, whether you thought those were possible, and what kind of implication they have for meteorological views.
I don't think. My strong suspicion is that gunk is not possible, because our world is a world. Well, I mean, we don't really know what it's like now, but it pretty clearly isn't gunky. If the standard, I suppose it would be unwise to say anything like the standard model in high energy physics is the true picture of the physical world. But at any rate, according to that model, an electron is a point mass and point charge, all squeezed down to the same little point in space. And so it doesn't have any proper parts, an electron. And there are all kinds of things that don't have any proper parts. So according to, in the gunk world, everything has proper parts, which implies that there are no points. There are no point objects, because if there were, they couldn't have proper parts. I don't know whether there are possible worlds in which there is physical stuff that's radically different from the stuff in our world. I mean, I'm sure there are possible worlds in which some of the numbers in the laws of physics, the fine structure constant, for example. No doubt there are, in the actual world, the strong nuclear force is about 137 times stronger than electromagnetism. And electromagnetism is about 10 to the 39th power times stronger than gravity. I suppose that there are probably worlds in which those numbers are different. But as to whether there are worlds in which the structure of the laws of physics is different, or the basic entities have different mereological properties, I find that, very hard to believe. It's not that I believe the opposite, but if I had to take a bet on it with, say, God holding the stakes or something like that, God will settle the bet, I would certainly bet against there being any gunky worlds.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question. So I'm starting to teach philosophy on a high level, and one of my I guess I don't know how to balance just educating them on the various views versus the extent in which I don't want to say impose my views, but obviously have a lot of influence in the classroom. And certainly this is not just a problem for like educators, but there are people, that ask people that know a lot about philosophy, about these various views. And I wanted to know what you thought in terms of how do you balance, okay, this is what people are saying, this is what these things mean, and here's what doesn't make sense to me, or here's what I think I take to be false, or whatever.
Well, I once, as a student, I had a long time ago at Syracuse University. Yeah, she's probably now in her late 60s, but she was 18 years old then. But I heard her at a banquet once describe what it was like to have me as a teacher when she was an undergraduate. And she said, we could never find out what he believed. If you're doing things right, that should be the reaction of your students. You present the arguments on both sides. You've got to train yourself, I guess, to be good at presenting arguments that you don't accept. I'm pretty good at that. My problem is that there's so much that philosophers say that I don't understand. It's easier for me to pretend to believe something that I don't believe than it is to pretend to understand something I don't understand. If I'm going to be teaching Josiah Royce and I come to the sentence, the world is a progressively realized community of interpretation, and I don't know how to pretend that I understand what that's saying. But at least I can try to be neutral between competing theories that I do understand. So that's what you got to try, and I would recommend. I won't say that's what you've got to do. What I would recommend is trying to ask yourself, will my students come out of this class saying, I wonder what he believes? We can never find out what he believes. Okay, that's insofar as I've got advice, that's my advice.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. If Carter Document is here, you can ask your question relatively quickly.
Yeah. Hi, Peter. Hello, Professor Peter. I had a pretty long question, and I'm trying to think about how I can keep it short, given that the AMA is going to be closing in a bit. But perhaps I should just begin by asking, do you recall this argument that you give in your 1990 paper, four-dimensional objects? People typically call it the Descartes minus or the Descartes diminished argument.
Yeah, I know. I don't know that that's what people called it, but I know about I know what argument you're talking about.
Okay, yeah. So you try to demonstrate that four-dimensionalism can't be sustained because it implies some implausible modal commitments.
Well, I mean,
Um,
that is, you can sustain it if you're willing to be a counterpart theorist.
yeah, I say that in the question, like David Lewis would be fine.
Well, he said that to me. He said, of course, David once said to me, of course, I don't object to it on that account.
Well, you maintain that it violates the modal principle about identity, that x equals y, then necessarily x equals y. So if this conclusion, Descartes
Right.
could not have been
But
a
of
temporal
course,
extent greater or lesser
that
than.
isn't the translation of that into counterpart theory isn't true.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
I was just reading this, and it appears to me that the argument seems to be an instance of a failure of intersubstitutivity of the co-referring expressions, because on the left-hand side of the identity we have the rigid designator Descartes, and then on the right-hand side of the identity we have the definite description, the temporal part of Descartes, stretching from 1596 to 1649, where we don't include the last year of his life, right? So what I was I think the question I wanted to ask was, what would you say in response to someone trying to undermine your argument against four-dimensionalism, this particular one, by arguing that you...
I think there was more to it than just modal logic. There was some metaphysics in there that said the metaphysics was a temporal part of something couldn't be longer than it was, or a temporal part has this property of modal inductility.
Yeah. So you argue that Descartes, for the sake of the argument, we take Descartes as an example of a persisting object when that perdured from 1596 to 1650, in that his temporal extent is not essential to him, right? That's something else that you mentioned, right? So you argue that temporal parts, they have objects have their temporal parts essentially, and so if Descartes himself is one of those temporal parts, right, then he himself would be modally inductive.
You look at the other possible world where Descartes lived, say, a year longer, and in which right up to a certain point late in his life, the worlds were absolutely identical in the way matter was distributed in space-time. Matter and energy are distributed in space-time. Then they begin to diverge. What about the part of Descartes that's in the worlds where they're not divergent? So now just look at that object, that temporal part of Descartes in that world. Now look at Descartes in this world, or not quite Descartes. Let's say the temporal part of Descartes that's right up to before he caught cold, let's say, because Descartes did die rather suddenly of pneumonia, I believe. It's not that he had some long lingering illness. So go a few days before he caught cold and compare that temporal part of Descartes with in fact, the easier thing to do, in fact, would be to, let's suppose that Descartes was simply annihilated in the actual world. Maybe or pick somebody in this world who makes the wrong move while disarming a hydrogen bomb and is simply instantly vaporized. And then there's a other possible world where he isn't, where nothing happens. Well, he's got this, there's this temporal part of the person in the other world that's a perfect duplicate of him in this world. So what is he in that world? Is he the whole thing that goes by his name in that world, or is he the temporal part? There's a strong argument for saying that a temporal part of something, if then there's an object that's a perfect duplicate of that temporal part in another world, they are identical. So if you accept that, then you have to get a violation of if x equals y, then necessarily x equals y. Because that would mean that from that and that Descartes lived a year, the proposition Descartes lived a year longer in that world.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we're just about at 5 o'clock, I think. Unless you're free to take one more question, we're probably gonna wrap it up around there. What do you think?
I'll take one more question if it isn't a long one.
Sure. Yeah. So we had another question from Quick Brown Frogs. He's asking what your general view is on actualism and possibilism. Do you find the debate meaningful? And what do you think about planning a serious actualism and Hasides?
I'm not serious actualism would make it a long question. I'll just mention actualism. So to say that something is actual, that all depends on, I think, what category the thing belongs to. Actual world is the world that actually obtains or is actually realized. But what is an actual pig? An actual pig has to be a pig that actually exists, right? Now, what does the adverb actually do? Well, not very much, semantically speaking. Just what's the difference between saying this rose is actually red and this rose is red? What's the difference between saying that this guy is actually rich and this guy is rich? Not much, if anything. The function of actually does seem rather to be one of emphasis and pragmatics. So an actual pig is a pig that actually exists. That is a pig that exists. And that means that a non-actual or merely possible pig would be a pig that doesn't exist. But a pig that doesn't exist is just a pig that isn't there. That is a pig such there is no such pig. Well, there aren't any such. Therefore, there aren't any non-actual objects. Now, there's more to be said about that. I mean, then what do we do with the universal class in semantics for quantified modal logic and so on? But since this was going to be a short question and answer, that's pretty much where I'm going to have to stop.
All right. Thank you so much. That's great. Thank you for taking and answering all the questions and staying so long. Thanks to everyone for sticking around to listen, and if you did, for asking your questions.
And thank you for inviting me. I'm very grateful. And thank you for your excellent questions.
Yeah, this has been great.
Thank you.
Day.
Thank you so much, Professor Van Inwagen.
Sure. Bye now.
Bye.
Take care.
Everybody.